The Wyoming wind cut across the high plains like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Along the rutted dirt road that connected the scattered homesteads to the lumber mill in Pine Ridge, a solitary figure struggled against both the elements and the weight of her burden. Rebecca Harrison's calloused hands gripped the rope that secured a load of rough-hewn planks to her makeshift sledge, each step forward a testament to determination that had been forged in the crucible of necessity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 7 months pregnant, she should have been resting by a warm fire, preparing for the arrival of her child. Instead, she was dragging lumber across 5 miles of unforgiving terrain because the alternative was watching her half-built cabin remain forever incomplete as winter approached with merciless certainty. The baby kicked against her ribs as if protesting this latest indignity, but Rebecca simply adjusted her grip and kept moving forward. She had learned, in the hardest possible way, that survival on the frontier demanded sacrifices that would have seemed unthinkable in her former life. The delicate hands that had once embroidered samplers and arranged flowers now bore permanent calluses from saw handles and splitting mauls. The woman who had once fainted at the sight of blood now dressed her own wounds and pressed forward through pain that would have felled stronger men. But today, as the sledge caught on another rock and nearly sent her sprawling, Rebecca Harrison felt the first crack in the armor of determination that had carried her through months of backbreaking labor. The lumber represented her last chance to complete the cabin before the first serious snowfall. Without shelter, both she and her unborn child would face a winter that neither would likely survive. The day had started before dawn, as they all did now. Rebecca had learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the rhythm of necessity that governed frontier life. Water to be hauled from the creek, a fire to be coaxed from the previous night's embers, and the endless calculations of survival that filled her mind. From the moment she opened her eyes until exhaustion finally claimed her each night, she had walked the 3 miles to Pine Ridge in darkness, guided by the faint glow of oil lamps in the distant windows of the lumber mill. Her pregnancy made the journey increasingly difficult, but the mill workers began their day early, and late arrivals often found themselves at the back of a line that could stretch for hours. Every minute counted when winter was approaching with the inevitability of an avalanche. The lumber mill was a symphony of controlled chaos when she arrived. Steam engines powered massive saws that screamed through logs the size of wagon wheels, sending clouds of sawdust into the air that caught the morning light like golden snow. Men shouted orders over the mechanical din, their voices competing with the rhythmic thunder of falling timber, and the whistle of the mill's engine that marked the beginning of another day's work. Rebecca had stood in line behind ranchers and homesteaders, all clutching their carefully hoarded coins and calculating board feet against dwindling resources. She had counted her own money 3 times, coins earned through the sale of eggs from her few remaining chickens and vegetables from the garden that had somehow survived despite her inexperience. Every penny had been accounted for, every board. An EASURED twice before purchase, because there would be no second chances if she miscalculated. The mill foreman, a gruff man named Patterson who treated every transaction like a personal favor, had looked skeptical when she'd approached with her order. A pregnant woman buying lumber for construction was unusual enough to draw stares from the other customers, but Rebecca had learned to ignore the whispered conversations that followed her everywhere she went. "You sure about this, Mrs. Patterson?" had asked, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. "This here's enough lumber to frame a whole wall. That's man's work you're talking about." "I'm sure," she had replied, keeping her voice steady despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. "I need it cut to these specifications." She had handed him a piece of paper covered with careful measurements, the result of hours spent studying. the construction manual her late husband had left behind. Patterson had shrugged and taken her money, apparently deciding that her poor judgment was none of his concern. Within an hour, her lumber had been loaded onto the sledge she had constructed from salvaged materials and raw determination. The contraption was more hope than engineering, but it had served her well enough for previous trips. The journey back to her homestead had started well enough. The morning air was crisp but not yet bitter, and the road was firm beneath her feet. The sledge runners, fashioned from strips of metal salvaged from an abandoned wagon, glided smoothly over the packed earth. For the first mile, Rebecca had allowed herself to feel something approaching optimism, but Wyoming weather was notoriously fickle, and by the second mile, the wind had picked up with a vengeance. What had been a gentle breeze became a howling gust that threatened to tear the lumber from its restraints and send the carefully stacked boards tumbling across the prairie. Rebecca had been forced to stop repeatedly to check and tighten the ropes, her numbed fingers struggling with knots that seemed determined to work themselves loose. The third mile had brought the first real crisis. A wheel on the sledge, crafted from wood she had seasoned herself, finally succumbed to the stress of repeated use and cracked completely through. The sudden lurch had nearly sent her tumbling, and only her desperate grab for the guide rope had prevented a fall that could have been catastrophic in her condition. With no replacement wheel and no tools adequate for field repairs, Rebecca had been forced to improvise. Using rocks and pieces of scrap wood, she had managed to create a makeshift skid that allowed the sledge to continue moving, though at a greatly reduced pace and with considerably more effort required to keep it moving. Forward. By the fourth mile, her back was screaming in protest, and her swollen ankles had begun to throb with each step. The baby seemed to sense her distress and had become increasingly active, delivering kicks that took her breath away and made forward progress even more difficult. She had been forced to stop every few hundred yards to rest, precious time ticking away as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind was no longer content to simply harass her progress. It had developed a personal vendetta, seeming to deliberately shift direction whenever she managed to find her rhythm in her walking. Dust devils danced across the prairie like miniature tornadoes, and the smell of rain was growing stronger with each passing hour. Rebecca's water supply, carefully rationed in a single canteen, was running dangerously low. She had learned the hard way that dehydration could be as deadly as any other frontier hazard, particularly for a woman in her condition. But the nearest reliable water source was still more than a mile away, and she couldn't afford to leave the lumber unguarded while she made the detour. The fifth mile had become a test of pure willpower against the growing certainty that she had finally pushed herself beyond the limits of human endurance. Her vision had begun to blur at the edges, and she found herself stumbling over obstacles that should have been easily avoided. The sledge felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and the rope burns on her palms were bleeding through the worn fabric of her gloves. When she had finally crested the small rise that gave her the first view of her homestead, Rebecca had felt her heart sink like a stone. The half-completed cabin stood exactly as she had left it that morning, its unfinished walls a stark reminder of how much work remained before winter's arrival. The lumber she was hauling represented just one more step in a journey that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of her. The cabin, such as it was, consisted of 3 walls and the foundation for a 4th. The roof existed only in her imagination and in the pages of the construction manual that had become her Bible. She had managed to create a structure that would provide some protection from the elements, but without the 4th wall and proper roofing, it would be little more than a windbreak when the real cold arrived. Her temporary shelter, a canvas lean-to stretched between 2 of the completed walls, had suffered damage during the recent windstorms. The fabric was torn in several places, and the repair patches she had applied were already showing signs of strain. Every night spent in the inadequate shelter was a gamble against weather that grew more severe with each passing day. The lumber she was hauling would allow her to complete the fourth wall, but only if she could manage the construction work herself. The boards would need to be cut to precise lengths, fitted together with joints that would hold against winter winds, and secured with nails that cost almost as much as the lumber itself. Every aspect of the construction required skills. She was still learning through trial and error that she couldn't afford as she approached her homestead. Rebecca noticed that her small vegetable garden was showing signs of stress from the recent cold snaps. The potato plants, which had represented her primary food source for the coming winter, were beginning to wither despite her careful tending. Without a root cellar to protect her harvest, she would lose everything to the first hard freeze. The few chickens that remained from her original flock, huddled together in their makeshift coop, a structure that had been designed for summer weather, and would need substantial reinforcement to protect the birds through winter. The loss of even one chicken would represent a significant blow to her ability to generate income through egg sales. Her well, hand-dug with borrowed tools and sheer determination, was showing signs of the seasonal drop in water table that made Wyoming homesteading such a precarious endeavor. The bucket came up less full with each trip, and she had begun to worry that the water source might fail entirely during the dry winter months. Standing at the edge of her property, surrounded by the evidence of her struggles and the magnitude of the challenges that remained, Rebecca Harrison felt the weight of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. The lumber on the sledge represented hope, but hope tempered by the growing realization that she might have finally reached the limits of what one person could accomplish alone. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if reminding her that time was running short and the stakes were higher than just her own survival. In a few short months, she would be responsible for protecting the helpless infant through a Wyoming winter that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The thought filled her with a determination that bordered on desperation, but even determination had its limits when faced with the harsh realities of frontier life. As the first fat raindrops began to fall from the darkening sky, Rebecca Harrison made a silent promise to her unborn child. Whatever it took, however much she had to sacrifice, she would find a way to create a safe haven before winter's arrival. The alternative was simply unthinkable, and she had already learned that thinking the unthinkable was a luxury she could no longer afford. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally began in earnest as Rebecca struggled to drag the sledge across the uneven ground toward her cabin. What started as scattered droplets quickly transformed into a steady downpour that turned the Wyoming dust into treacherous mud. The wooden runners of her improvised sledge, already damaged from the broken wheel, began to dig furrows in the softening earth. Instead of gliding smoothly across the surface, each step became a battle against suction that seemed determined to claim her boots entirely. The rope in her hands grew slippery, and more than once she nearly lost her grip as the sledge lurched sideways into a rut. The canvas tarp she had thrown over the lumber was doing little to protect her precious cargo from the driving rain, and she could see water beginning to pool in the joints between the boards. From his position on a distant ridge, Jake Mitchell watched the lone figure struggling across the prairie below. He had been tracking a small herd of wild horses that had been raiding the meager hay supplies of the scattered homesteads in the area, hoping to capture one or two animals that might be broken and sold to supplement his dwindling resources. The horses had vanished into the maze of canyons that cut through the landscape, but the sight of someone in obvious distress had captured his attention instead. Jake was no stranger to hardship himself. At 28, he possessed little more than the clothes on his back, a temperamental horse named Thunder, and a stubborn refusal to give up on a dream that seemed to grow more elusive with each passing season. He had arrived in Wyoming 3 years earlier with grand plans of establishing his own ranch, But a series of setbacks had reduced those ambitions to a simple struggle for survival. His own shelter was a dugout carved into a hillside, reinforced with salvaged timber and chinked with mud mixed with prairie grass. It was hardly more sophisticated than a cave, but it had kept him alive through 2 brutal winters and provided a base of operations for his attempts to build something resembling a sustainable life. Unlike many of the failed homesteaders who had given up and returned east, Jake possessed a combination of practical skills and sheer stubbornness that had allowed him to endure where others had failed. Watching the figure below struggle with what appeared to be a heavily loaded sledge, Jake found himself caught between his natural inclination to help and the hard-learned wisdom of frontier self-preservation. Getting involved in other people's problems was a luxury that someone in his position could rarely afford. Resources were too scarce and winter too close to risk his own survival for the sake of a stranger. But as he continued to observe, something about the scene below began to bother him. The figure's movements were wrong somehow, lacking the fluid strength that such work required. When the person stumbled and nearly fell while attempting to navigate around a particularly large boulder, Jake realized with a shock that he was watching a woman attempting to move what appeared to be several 100 pounds of lumber across increasingly difficult terrain. The realization changed everything. Jake had been raised by a mother who had managed to hold their small farm together after his father's death, and he had learned early that women on the frontier often possessed a strength that went far beyond the physical. But he had also learned that such strength had limits, and that recognizing those limits was often the difference between survival and tragedy. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, Jake urged thunder down the slope toward the struggling figure. His horse was a paint stallion with a temperament as unpredictable as Wyoming weather, but the animal had developed an understanding with his rider that transcended the usual relationship between man and beast. They had kept each other alive through situations that would have broken lesser partnerships. As he drew closer, Jake could see that his initial assessment had been conservative. The woman was not just struggling with heavy lumber. She was visibly pregnant and appeared to be near exhaustion. Her clothing, practical frontier attire that had seen considerable wear, was soaked through from the rain. The sledge she was attempting to pull had clearly suffered some kind of mechanical failure, and the makeshift repairs were barely holding together under the strain. "Ma'am," he called out as he approached, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "Looks like you could use some assistance." Rebecca looked up sharply, water streaming from the brim of her hat. Her first instinct was wariness, a response that had been honed by months of dealing with the various characters that populated the frontier. Some offered genuine help, but others saw a woman alone as an opportunity for exploitation. Her hand moved instinctively to the knife she kept at her belt, a tool that served multiple purposes in frontier life. "I'm managing," she replied, though her voice carried a breathlessness that belied her words. "Just trying to get this lumber to my place before the weather gets worse." Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was assessing him as either potential help or potential threat. It was a survival skill that every frontier woman developed, and he respected her caution even as he hoped to alleviate it. "Names." "Jake Mitchell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I've got a dugout about 2 miles north of here. Been watching you work that sledge, and I have to say, you're doing something most grown men would find challenging." Up close, Rebecca could see that Jake Mitchell was not the prosperous rancher or traveling businessman that his offer of help might have suggested. His clothes, while clean and well-maintained, showed the kind of careful patching that spoke of limited resources. His boots had been resolved multiple times, and his hat showed the wear patterns of someone who spent most of his time outdoors working for survival rather than profit. But there was something in his manner that suggested genuine concern rather than opportunism. His horse, while clearly a quality animal, was lean in a way that indicated careful rationing of feed. Everything about the man suggested someone who understood hardship from personal experience rather than observation. "Rebecca Harrison," she replied after a moment's consideration. "And you're right, it is challenging. Especially when your equipment decides to fail at the worst possible moment." Jake examined the sledge with the eye of someone who had become expert at making do with inadequate materials. The broken wheel had been replaced with an ingenious arrangement of rocks and scrap wood that showed considerable practical intelligence, but the solution was clearly temporary and was already showing signs of failure under the current conditions. "You built this sledge yourself?" he asked, genuine admiration in his voice. "Had to," Rebecca replied, allowing a note of pride to creep into her voice. "Couldn't afford to buy proper equipment, and I needed something to move materials from the mill." Jake nodded approvingly. The frontier had a way of turning ordinary people into inventive engineers, and the sledge represented the kind of creative problem-solving that often meant the difference between success and failure in an unforgiving environment. But he could also see that the device had reached the limits of its usefulness. "If you don't mind my saying so," Jake said carefully, "trying to move this much weight in these conditions is asking for trouble. That wheel replacement is clever, but it's not going to hold much longer, and if it fails completely, you could be looking at scattered lumber across half the territory." Rebecca knew he was right, but admitting it meant acknowledging that she had once again reached the limits of her ability to handle the challenges of frontier life alone. Every compromise, every acceptance of help, felt like a step backward from the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. "What do you suggest?" she asked, the question emerging despite her reluctance to appear helpless. "Well," Jake said, studying the problem with the careful attention of someone who had spent years making impossible situations work, "I've got some proper wheels back at my place, salvaged from a wagon that didn't survive last winter's storms. They're not pretty, but they're functional. We could probably rig something that would get your lumber where it needs to go." The offer was practical and seemed genuine, but Rebecca had learned to be suspicious of solutions that seemed too convenient. "And what would you want in return?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his response. The honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure what he wanted in return, beyond the simple satisfaction of helping someone in genuine need. But he understood her suspicion and recognized that frontier survival often depended on clearly defined exchanges of value. "To tell you the truth," he said finally, "I could use the help myself. I've been trying to improve my own shelter before. Winter and some of the work requires more than one person. If you're willing to lend a hand with a few projects, we could call it even." It was a face-saving offer that allowed both parties to maintain their dignity while acknowledging mutual need. Rebecca found herself studying Jake's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw instead was exhaustion that matched her own, and a kind of weathered honesty that came from someone who had learned that survival was easier when people helped each other. "Your dugout," she said. "How far is it really?" "About 2 miles, Jake replied. "Maybe a little more with the terrain. But I've got a decent workshop set up there, and we could get those wheels mounted properly instead of trying to field repair them in this weather." Rebecca looked at her lumber, already showing signs of water damage despite the tarp, then at the darkening sky that promised the storm was far from over. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through months of challenges, recognized that continuing in current conditions was likely to result in disaster. "All right," she said finally, "but I want to be clear about the terms. I help you with your projects, you help me get this lumber where it needs to go, and we both maintain our own properties and independence." Jake nodded seriously, agreed. "Though I should probably mention that my hospitality runs more toward beans and coffee than fancy cooking. I'm not exactly set up for entertaining guests." Despite the stress of her situation, Rebecca found herself almost smiling. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been living on eggs and whatever vegetables I can coax from stubborn soil. Beans and coffee sound like a feast." Working together, they managed to secure the lumber more effectively against the weather and rig Thunder with additional rope to help pull the sledge. The paint stallion seemed to understand the importance of the task and threw his considerable strength into the effort with an enthusiasm that suggested he was as tired of standing around in the rain as his human companions. The journey to Jake's dugout took nearly an hour, but with the horse's help, the damaged sledge held together long enough to reach shelter. As they worked, Rebecca found herself reassessing her initial impression of Jake Mitchell. His conversation was practical rather than charming, focused on immediate problems rather than grand promises. He asked questions about her construction project that showed genuine understanding of the challenges involved, and his suggestions for improving her techniques came from obvious personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. When Jake's dugout finally came into view, Rebecca was surprised by what she saw. The structure was indeed carved into a hillside, but the workmanship was far more sophisticated than his modest description had suggested. The entrance was protected by a well-constructed wall of fitted stones, and smoke rising from a metal chimney indicated a proper heating system rather than the open fire she had expected. "It's not much," Jake said, clearly feeling the need to apologize for his humble circumstances. "But it's warm and dry, and there's enough space to work on your sledge properly." Rebecca, who had spent months living in a canvas lean-to, found herself impressed rather than disappointed. The dugout represented exactly the kind of practical engineering that frontier life demanded. It would be warm in winter, cool in summer, and virtually invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. As they unhitched Thunder and began the process of moving the lumber under cover, Rebecca realized that for the first time in months, she was working alongside someone who understood both the immediate challenges she faced and the longer-term struggle for survival that defined frontier life. It was a strange feeling after so much solitude, but not an unwelcome one. The rain continued to drum against the earth above their heads as they secured her precious lumber in Jake's workshop area. But for the first time that day, Rebecca Harrison allowed herself to feel something that might have been hope. Jake's dugout revealed itself to be far more sophisticated than its humble exterior suggested. The main living area had been carved with surprising precision, creating a space that was both functional and comfortable despite its underground nature. The walls were lined with fitted stone that provided excellent insulation, and a series of carefully positioned oil lamps created pools of warm light that banished the underground gloom. Rebecca found herself genuinely impressed by the ingenuity of the construction. A raised wooden floor kept everything dry despite the earthen walls, and a complex system of drainage channels ensured that even heavy rains wouldn't create flooding problems. The workshop area, separated from the living quarters by a cleverly designed partition, contained tools that had clearly been collected and maintained over several years of careful scavenging. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth stone wall that formed the main support structure. Jake nodded, though she could see a flash of something that might have been embarrassment cross his face. "Took the better part of 2 years, working mostly in winter when outdoor work was impossible. Started as just a basic shelter, but I kept adding improvements whenever I could find materials." The workshop contained treasures that any frontier builder would envy. Salvaged wheels of various sizes hung from hooks along one wall, while hand tools arranged with military precision occupied a workbench that had been constructed from planks so perfectly fitted that no gaps were visible between them. Most impressive of all was a small forge area where Jake could perform basic metalwork, complete with a bellows system that drew air from the surface through an ingenious network of pipes. "This is remarkable," Rebecca said, genuinely amazed by the level of craftsmanship. You could build almost anything with equipment like this. That's the idea, Jake replied, beginning to sort through wheels that might fit Rebecca's sledge. On the frontier, being able to fix or build whatever you need is often the difference between making it through winter and becoming. Another story about folks who didn't prepare properly, as they worked together to find the right components for repairing the sledge. Rebecca began to understand that Jake Mitchell was far more than the simple cowboy his appearance might suggest. His knowledge of construction techniques was comprehensive, and his ability to visualize solutions to mechanical problems spoke of an engineering mind that had been honed by years of practical application. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked, as Jake demonstrated how a particular wheel assembly could be modified to work with her sledge's unique design. "My father was a millwright back in Missouri," Jake explained, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he made adjustments to the wheel mounting. "He taught me that understanding how things work together is more valuable than owning fancy equipment. When I came west, I brought his tools and his philosophy about making do with what you have." The conversation revealed layers of Jake's background that explained his current circumstances. His father had died when Jake was barely 20, leaving behind debts that had consumed the family mill and forced the sale of everything valuable. Jake had come west not to seek his fortune, but to escape the burden of inherited failure and build something entirely his own. "What about you?" Jake asked as they worked. "You mentioned building a cabin. That's ambitious work for anyone, especially ... He gestured diplomatically toward her condition. Rebecca found herself sharing more of her story than she had with anyone since arriving in Wyoming. She told him about her husband David, a gentle man who had been better with books than tools, and their shared dream of establishing a homestead that could support a growing family. David's death in a mill accident had left her with partially completed plans and the stubborn determination to finish what they had started together. "He drew up all the specifications," she explained, pulling folded papers from her coat pocket. "Everything measured and calculated. I've been following his plans exactly, but some of the construction techniques..." She trailed off, clearly frustrated by the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Jake studied the drawings with professional interest. David Harrison had indeed been thorough in his planning, creating detailed blueprints. That would have made construction straightforward for someone with adequate skills and resources. But Rebecca was attempting to execute these plans with minimal experience and improvised tools, a challenge that would have daunted most experienced builders. "These are good plans," Jake said honestly. "Your husband knew what he was doing. But some of these joints are going to require techniques that take practice to master. Have you had problems with the corner assemblies?" Rebecca's relief at finding someone who could understand the technical challenges was evident. "The southeast corner keeps pulling apart. I've rebuilt it 3 times, but it won't hold when the wind gets strong." Jake nodded knowingly. "Corner joints are tricky. The forces involved aren't just vertical. You've got lateral stress from wind, seasonal expansion and contraction, and foundation settling. If the joint isn't cut precisely, it'll fail every time." Over the next several hours, as the storm continued to rage outside, Jake and Rebecca worked together on both the sledge repair and a detailed analysis of her construction challenges. What emerged was a partnership that played to both their strengths. Rebecca's careful attention to her husband's specifications, combined with Jake's practical building experience, created solutions that neither could have developed alone. The repaired sledge was more robust than the original, incorporating design improvements that would help it handle heavy loads across difficult terrain. But more importantly, they had developed a plan for completing Rebecca's cabin that addressed the technical problems she had been struggling with for months. "The key is going to be the foundation work," Jake explained, sketching modifications to David's original plans. "Your husband designed this for level ground, but Wyoming soil settles differently than what he was probably familiar with back east. We need to compensate for that with better drainage and deeper footings. As they talked, Rebecca began to realize that Jake's offer of mutual assistance might be exactly what both of them needed. His skills complemented her determination, while her lumber and her husband's detailed plans could help Jake improve his own shelter in ways that would benefit them both through the coming winter. "You mentioned needing help with your own projects," she said during a break in their planning session. "What kind of improvements are you trying to make?" Jake gestured toward the living area of his dugout. "This place keeps me alive, but it's not exactly comfortable for long-term living. I've been planning to expand the workshop area and maybe add a proper root cellar for food storage. The problem is that most of the work requires someone to hold things in place while I do the construction." It was exactly the kind of arrangement that made sense for both parties. Rebecca needed technical expertise and additional labor power to complete her cabin before winter. Jake needed an extra pair of hands and access to proper building materials to improve his own situation. Neither was offering charity or accepting it. Instead, they were proposing a genuine partnership between equals. "There's something else," Jake said, his tone becoming more serious. "Winter's coming fast, and your cabin isn't going to be ready in time, even with help. But if we work together on both projects, you could winter here while we finish your place come spring." The suggestion was practical but carried implications that both of them understood. Frontier survival often required arrangements that would have been scandalous in more settled communities. But the alternative, Rebecca attempting to survive a Wyoming winter in an incomplete cabin while heavily pregnant, was simply not viable. "That's a generous offer," Rebecca said carefully. "But I need to understand what you'd expect in return." Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through his response. "I'd expect you to contribute to food and fuel costs according to your ability. I'd expect help with the work that needs doing to prepare for winter. And I'd expect honesty about what you're comfortable with and what you're not." It was a remarkably straightforward proposal that treated her as an equal partner rather than a dependent. Rebecca found herself considering possibilities that had seemed impossible when she was struggling alone. "My chickens," she said suddenly. "I've got 6 hens that have been laying well. They'll need shelter for winter anyway, and fresh eggs would improve both our diets considerably. There's a natural alcove in the hillside that would make a perfect chicken co-op," Jake replied, warming to the discussion. "I've been thinking about getting some birds myself, but starting a flock from scratch is expensive." They spent the remainder of the day developing detailed plans for their partnership. Rebecca would move her essential belongings and livestock to Jake's expanded homestead while they worked together to prepare both locations for winter survival. Her cabin would be completed in phases, with the most critical work done before the first serious snow, and the finishing details handled during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. But beyond the practical arrangements, something else was developing between them. Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying Jake's company in a way that surprised her. His conversation was intelligent without being condescending, and his respect for her abilities was clearly genuine rather than polite fiction. Jake, for his part, was discovering that having someone to share the daily challenges of frontier life made even the most difficult tasks seem manageable. Rebecca's determination and practical intelligence impressed him, but it was her quiet strength in the face of overwhelming obstacles that he found most remarkable. As evening approached, and the storm finally began to subside, they worked together to prepare a meal from Jake's basic supplies, supplemented by vegetables Rebecca had brought from her own garden. The simple combination of beans, cornbread, and fresh greens became something approaching a feast when shared between people who understood the value of each ingredient. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Rebecca said, and Jake could tell she wasn't just being polite. "It's the company," Jake replied. "Food tastes better when you're not eating alone." After dinner, They sat by the oil lamp reviewing David's construction plans and Jake's ideas for improvements. The conversation gradually moved beyond technical details to more personal topics. Rebecca spoke about her fears for the coming winter and her determination to create a secure home for her child. Jake talked about his dreams of eventually expanding his operation into a proper ranch, complete with cattle and the kind of prosperity that would allow him to build a real house instead of living underground. "Do you think it's possible?" Rebecca asked. "Building something permanent out here, I mean. Sometimes it feels like the country is too harsh for anything but the most basic survival." Jake considered the question seriously. "I think it's possible for people who are willing to work together," he said finally. "The folks who try to do everything alone usually don't make it. But partnerships, real partnerships where people complement each other's strengths, those have a chance." As the evening wore on, they finalized the details of their arrangement. Rebecca would return to her homestead the next day to collect her essential belongings and livestock, while Jake prepared the coupe vide, dugout for expanded occupancy. They would work together on the most critical cabin improvements during the remaining good weather, then focus on winter preparation and interior finishing work once the snow arrived. It was a practical solution to immediate problems, but both of them sensed that they were beginning something that might become more significant than simple mutual assistance. They were careful not to articulate these possibilities directly, but the foundation for deeper partnership was being established through shared work and growing trust. When Rebecca finally settled into the sleeping area Jake had prepared for her, separated from his own space by a curtain that provided privacy while maintaining propriety, she found herself feeling more optimistic about the future than she had since David's death. The challenges ahead remained formidable, but for the first time, she wouldn't be facing them entirely alone. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the kind of crisp, clear air that reminded everyone why people fell in love with Wyoming, despite its hardships. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in the warm security of Jake's well-built shelter, Rebecca Harrison allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just survival, but the possibility of genuine prosperity built through partnership and shared dreams. 3 weeks into their partnership, the rhythm of shared work had transformed both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. The early morning routine now began with Jake stoking the forge while Rebecca tended to the chickens, their movements coordinated by an efficiency that spoke of genuine collaboration rather than mere convenience. The expanded chicken coop had become a marvel of practical engineering, incorporating Jake's structural expertise with Rebecca's understanding of what the birds actually needed for optimal egg production. The transformation of Jake's homestead was remarkable. What had begun as a simple dugout designed for solitary survival was evolving into something that resembled a proper frontier farm. Rebecca's 6 hens had settled into their new quarters with obvious contentment, rewarding their improved circumstances with a steady supply of eggs that had become a valuable trade commodity with neighboring homesteads. More significantly, the addition of Rebecca's practical intelligence had accelerated projects that Jake had been contemplating for years. The root cellar excavation, which he had expected to take most of the winter, was completed in just 10 days thanks to Rebecca's systematic approach to moving earth and her insight into proper ventilation requirements. Her suggestion to line the walls with flat stones from the nearby creek had created storage conditions that would preserve vegetables and preserved foods. Well into spring. The expansion of the workshop area had been even more successful. Rebecca's careful measurements and Jake's construction skills had created additional space that was both larger and more efficiently organized than Jake's original design. The new area included specialized storage for different types of lumber, a dedicated space for fine woodworking, and a clever system of pulleys that allowed one person to handle materials that had previously required 2, but it was the daily collaboration on Rebecca's cabin project that had deepened their partnership beyond mere practical cooperation. Each morning, after completing essential homestead tasks, they would make the hour-long journey to Rebecca's property to continue the construction work. The routine had become a foundation for conversations that ranged from immediate technical challenges to long-term dreams for their respective futures. Rebecca's cabin was taking shape in ways that exceeded even David's original vision. Jake's modifications to the foundation design had solved the settling problems that had plagued her earlier attempts, while his expertise with joint construction had created walls that stood firm against Wyoming's notorious winds. More importantly, his suggestions for interior improvements had transformed the planned single-room structure into something approaching a real home. The partition wall here, Jake explained, indicating a section of the cabin's interior, could create a separate bedroom while still allowing heat circulation from the main fireplace. And if we angle this window just slightly, you'll get better light for reading during the short winter days. Rebecca found herself impressed not just by Jake's technical knowledge, but by his thoughtful consideration of how she would actually live in space. Unlike the generic advice she might have received from other builders, Jake's suggestions reflected careful observation of her habits and preferences developed over weeks of shared domestic routine. The work itself had become a source of unexpected satisfaction. Rebecca had discovered that she possessed both the strength and the aptitude for construction work when properly guided. Under Jake's patient instruction, she had learned to cut precise joints, install windows that would withstand seasonal expansion and contraction, and even perform basic metalwork on the small forge they had transported from Jake's workshop. "You've got good hands for this kind of work," Jake observed as Rebecca successfully completed a complex corner joint that had taken him years to master. "Your husband would be proud of how you're bringing his plans to life." The mention of David no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Over the weeks of working together, Rebecca had shared memories of her life with David that painted a picture of a gentle, scholarly man who had loved her deeply but had been overwhelmed by the practical challenges of frontier life. Jake's respectful questions about David's background and his genuine interest in understanding the original cabin design had helped Rebecca process her grief in ways that solitary mourning had not allowed. David was a dreamer, Rebecca said, smoothing the completed joint with obvious satisfaction. He could envision exactly how something should look when it was finished, but he struggled with the steps needed to get there. He would have loved watching this come together properly. Jake had developed his own appreciation for David Harrison's vision, even though they had never met. The original cabin plans showed careful thought about how a family would live in space, with clever design elements that prioritized comfort and efficiency over simple functionality. Jake found himself incorporating some of David's ideas into his own future building plans. The growing intimacy of their daily collaboration had created opportunities for conversations that revealed layers of personality and aspiration that their initial practical partnership had not explored. Rebecca learned that Jake's apparent contentment with his modest circumstances masked ambitious plans for expanding his operation into a genuine ranch. He had been carefully saving money from his various enterprises, planning to purchase cattle and additional land when he had accumulated sufficient resources. "The thing about cattle," Jake explained during one of their lunch breaks at the cabin site, "is that they require infrastructure before they can be profitable. Proper fencing, water systems, winter shelter, all the things that take time and money to establish. I've been building toward that goal for 3 years now, but I'm finally getting close to having what I need." Rebecca found herself genuinely interested in Jake's ranching ambitions. Her own experience with livestock was limited to chickens and the vegetable garden, but she could see how his methodical approach to building infrastructure might succeed where more impulsive ventures had failed. "What kind of cattle are you planning to raise?" she asked, demonstrating the kind of engaged interest that had become characteristic of their conversations. Probably start with a small herd of mixed breeding. Stock, Jake replied, clearly pleased by her genuine curiosity. Focus on animals that can handle Wyoming winters without requiring too much supplemental feeding. Build the herd gradually while I learn what works in this particular environment. These conversations about the future had naturally led to discussions about Rebecca's own long-term plans. The cabin would provide immediate shelter for her and the baby, but she would need to develop some form of income to sustain herself beyond the winter. Her success with the expanded chicken operation had suggested possibilities, but the challenges of marketing agricultural products in such a sparsely populated area were considerable. There's good money in fresh eggs, Jake observed, especially if you can establish reliable delivery routes to the mining camps up in the mountains. Those fellows pay premium prices for fresh food, and they're not particular about who supplies it. The suggestion opened up possibilities that Rebecca had not previously considered. The mining camps were notorious for their rough character, but they also represented a cash economy that could provide steady income for anyone willing to meet their needs for fresh food and basic supplies. Would that be safe? Rebecca asked. A woman traveling alone to mining camps? Not alone, Jake replied without hesitation, but as part of a regular supply route with proper security arrangements. That's different. There are established traders who make those runs regularly, and they're always looking for reliable suppliers of quality goods. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. For the first time, they were discussing long-term economic cooperation that extended far beyond mutual survival assistance. Rebecca began to envision a future where her domestic skills and Jake's frontier knowledge could create a sustainable partnership that benefited them both. As October progressed and the first serious frost warnings began to appear, their daily routine expanded to include preparation for Rebecca's confinement. Jake had quietly made arrangements with Mrs. Patterson, the midwife from Pine Ridge, to be available when Rebecca's time came. The conversation about birthing arrangements had been delicate, but Jake's matter-of-fact approach to the practical necessities had made the discussion easier than Rebecca had anticipated. Mrs. Patterson has attended most of the births in this area for the past 15 years, Jake explained. She's delivered babies under every kind of frontier condition you can imagine. If anyone can ensure that everything goes smoothly, it's her. The knowledge that professional help would be available had relieved one of Rebecca's greatest anxieties about the approaching birth. But beyond the practical arrangements, Jake's willingness to take responsibility for ensuring her safety during such a vulnerable time had touched her more deeply than any romantic gesture might have. Their evening conversations, conducted by lamplight in the comfortable warmth of the expanded dugout, had become the highlight of each day. They would review the progress on various projects, plan the next day's work, and gradually drift into more personal topics that revealed their deepest hopes and fears about the future. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met that day in the storm? Rebecca asked during one of these evening sessions. Jake considered the question seriously. You would have found a way to survive, he said finally. You're too stubborn to give up and too smart not to figure out solutions eventually. But it might have taken longer, and it certainly would have been harder. And you? Rebecca prompted. I probably would have spent another winter alone, making incremental improvements to my situation while convincing myself that solitary self-sufficiency was preferable to the complications of partnership, Jake admitted. It would have been a mistake. The admission hung between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to articulate directly. Their partnership had evolved beyond simple mutual assistance into something that resembled genuine affection, but both were cautious about moving too quickly toward possibilities that could complicate their practical arrangements. As Rebecca's pregnancy advanced into its final stages, Jake found himself developing protective instincts that surprised him with their intensity. He had begun to think of her safety and the welfare of her unborn child as responsibilities that were as important as his own survival. The realization was both comforting and slightly frightening, representing a level of emotional investment that made him vulnerable in ways that frontier life usually discouraged. Rebecca, for her part, had discovered that Jake's steady presence had transformed her anxiety about single motherhood into something approaching confidence. His obvious competence in handling practical challenges and his genuine interest in her welfare had created a sense of security that she had not experienced since David's death. "Whatever happens when the baby comes," she said during one of their planning sessions, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done. Not just the practical help, but the way you've made me feel like a partner rather than a burden." Jake looked up from the leather harness he was repairing, meeting her eyes directly. "You've never been a burden, Rebecca. You've been the best thing that's happened to me since I came to Wyoming." The statement was simple and honest, carrying emotional weight that both recognized but neither felt compelled to analyze immediately. They had built something valuable together, and both understood that protecting and nurturing that relationship was more important than rushing toward definitions that might not capture the complexity of their actual situation. As the first snow began to fall outside their warm shelter, Rebecca Harrison and Jake Mitchell settled into an evening routine that had become as comfortable as it was productive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued progress on their various projects, but tonight they were content to work quietly side by side, each finding satisfaction in the simple presence of someone who understood both their dreams and their practical determination to achieve them. The first crisis came not from the weather or wildlife, but from the community of Pine Ridge itself. Word of Rebecca and Jake's partnership had spread through the scattered homesteads with the speed that gossip always achieved in frontier communities, and not everyone approved of their unconventional arrangement. The trouble began when Reverend Caldwell, the circuit preacher who served the spiritual needs of the territory, arrived for his monthly visit to find the local moral authorities deeply concerned about the scandal brewing at Mitchell's dugout. Margaret Hutchkins, wife of the general store owner, had appointed herself the guardian of community standards, and she had been conducting a whisper campaign against Rebecca's living situation for the better part of 2 weeks. According to Margaret's interpretation of proper behavior, a pregnant widow sharing quarters with an unmarried man represented exactly the kind of moral corruption that threatened the civilized values they were trying to establish in the wilderness. "It's unseemly," Margaret declared during the impromptu community meeting that had been called to address the situation. "We have standards to maintain, even out here. What kind of example does this set for our children?" The meeting was held in the back room of Hutchkins' store, ostensibly to discuss preparations for the coming winter, but actually to organize community pressure against what Margaret saw as an intolerable violation of Christian propriety. Present were most of the established families within a day's ride of Pine Ridge, along with Reverend Caldwell, whose opinion would carry considerable weight in determining the community's official response. Jake learned about the meeting from Tom Bradley, a neighboring homesteader who had always maintained friendly relations with both Jake and Rebecca. Tom rode out to the dugout the morning after the gathering, his expression grim with the news he carried. "They're planning to force the issue," Tom reported without preamble. "Margaret Hutchkins has convinced half the community that your arrangement is a scandal that requires immediate correction. They're talking about organizing a formal delegation to demand that Rebecca either marry you or leave the territory entirely." The news hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been aware that some members of the community disapproved of their living arrangement, but he had underestimated both the intensity of that disapproval and Margaret Hutchkins' ability to organize opposition. The threat was serious enough to jeopardize not just Rebecca's reputation, but her physical safety during the most vulnerable period of her pregnancy. What exactly are they proposing? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Reverend Caldwell has been pressured to refuse all church services to anyone who associates with you, Tom explained. That includes access to the midwife, since Mrs. Patterson is considered part of the church community. They're also talking about organizing a trade boycott that would make it impossible for either of you to purchase supplies in Pine Ridge. The implications were staggering. Without access to the general store, Jake and Rebecca would be forced to travel more than 50 miles to the next trading post, a journey that would be impossible for Rebecca in her current condition and extremely difficult for Jake to manage alone. More critically, losing access to Mrs. Patterson's midwifery services could turn Rebecca's approaching confinement into a life-threatening crisis. Jake's first instinct was anger. The community's willingness to endanger a pregnant woman over questions of moral propriety struck him as fundamentally unchristian, regardless of their stated motivations. But anger wouldn't solve the immediate problem, and the practical challenges required careful thought rather than emotional response. Is there any possibility of reasoning with them? Jake asked. Tom shook his head pessimistically. Margaret's got them convinced that this is a test of the community's moral character. She's arguing that if they tolerate your situation, it will encourage other people to ignore proper standards. Reverend Caldwell seems torn, but he's under considerable pressure to take a strong stance. Rebecca, who had been listening to the conversation from the doorway, stepped forward with the kind of determined calm that Jake had learned to recognize as her response to serious challenges. "What if we did marry?" she asked quietly. "Would that satisfy their concerns?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Marriage would indeed solve the community's moral objections, but it would also fundamentally change the nature of their partnership in ways that neither had fully prepared for. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the practical aspects of the proposal, but the deeper questions about their relationship that such a step would raise. "Is that what you want?" he asked finally. "I want our child to be safe," Rebecca replied with characteristic directness. "I want to be able to access proper medical care when the time comes. And I want to protect what we've built together from people who seem determined to destroy it over questions of propriety." Tom Bradley, recognizing the delicate nature of the conversation he was witnessing, quietly excused himself with a promise to report back if the situation in town changed. After he left, Jake and Rebecca found themselves confronting questions that they had been carefully avoiding during the gradual development of their partnership. "Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly," Jake said, though his tone suggested he was thinking through possibilities rather than rejecting them, especially under pressure from outside forces. "No," Rebecca agreed. "But it's also not something to avoid when it makes practical sense and when the people involved care about each other." The admission was the closest either had come to directly acknowledging the emotional dimension of their relationship. Over the weeks of working together, sharing domestic routines, and planning for the future, they had developed feelings that went beyond simple partnership, but both had been cautious about moving too quickly toward commitments that could complicate their practical arrangements. "Do you care about me?" Jake asked, the question emerging with a vulnerability that surprised them both. "Yes," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "More than I expected to care about anyone again after David died. You've become essential to my life in ways that go beyond practical assistance." Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen at her words. "I feel the same way. I've been trying not to push too hard because I didn't want you to feel pressured, but if I'm honest, I've been hoping our partnership might develop into something deeper." The conversation continued through the morning as they worked together on routine tasks, both of them gradually exploring the possibility that marriage might represent not just a solution to their immediate crisis, but a natural progression of their already deep partnership. By midday, They had reached a decision that surprised them both with its clarity. "We'll do it," Rebecca said finally. "Not because Margaret Hutchins demands it, but because it's what we both want and because it's the right choice for our family." The reference to our family was deliberate and significant. Jake had already begun thinking of Rebecca's unborn child as his responsibility, and the prospect of legal recognition of that relationship was deeply appealing. Marriage would give him not just the right, but the obligation to protect both Rebecca and the baby, formalizing commitments that he had already made emotionally. But even as they made their decision, new complications were developing that would test their resolve in ways they hadn't anticipated. Word of the community's opposition had reached other interested parties, including Rebecca's late husband's family back in Illinois. David's brother, Thomas Harrison, had been contacted by someone, likely Margaret Hutchins herself, and informed about Rebecca's scandalous living situation. Thomas Harrison's response arrived by telegram late that afternoon, delivered by a writer who had made the journey from Pine Ridge specifically to ensure the message reached its destination. The telegram was brief but devastating in its implications. Widow's conduct brings shame to family name. Stop arrangements being made for child's proper upbringing. Stop legal proceedings initiated. Stop Thomas Harrison. Rebecca stared at the telegram with growing horror. Thomas Harrison was a wealthy businessman with political connections and the resources to make good on his threats. If he chose to challenge her fitness as a mother through the courts, he could potentially gain custody of her child based on her current living arrangements. "He can't do that," Jake said, reading over her shoulder. "You're the child's mother. No court would separate a baby from its mother over living arrangements." But Rebecca's expression suggested she was less confident about the legal protections available to her. "Thomas never approved of David marrying me," she explained. "He thought David was throwing his life away on a farm girl who wasn't good enough for the Harrison family name. If he can convince a judge that I'm morally unfit." The threat was real and immediate. Thomas Harrison had the financial resources to hire competent legal representation and the social connections to ensure his case received sympathetic consideration. More troubling, Rebecca's current circumstances, unmarried and living with a man to whom she wasn't related, could indeed be construed as evidence of moral unfitness by a conservative judge. "How long would it take him to get here?" Jake asked, his mind already moving toward practical countermeasures. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather slows travel, Rebecca calculated. But he might send representatives ahead of him, people with legal authority to take temporary custody pending court proceedings. The situation had suddenly become far more serious than community disapproval or even trade boycotts. They were facing the real possibility that Rebecca's child could be taken from her at birth and raised by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use legal manipulation to achieve their goals. Jake's response was immediate and decisive. "We will marry tomorrow," he said. "Before any legal representatives can arrive, before anyone can question the legitimacy of our family, we establish our legal rights and present a united front." Rebecca nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Will that be enough?" "Even if we're married, Thomas might argue that a hastily arranged frontier wedding is just a cover for an improper relationship." "Then we make sure it's not hasty," Jake replied, his voice carrying the kind of determined planning that had characterized his approach to every other challenge they had faced. "We do this properly, with community witnesses, church blessing, and legal documentation that can't be questioned." The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they would need to seek help from the same community leaders who had been organizing opposition to their relationship. But Reverend Caldwell, whatever his personal reservations, was unlikely to refuse to perform a marriage ceremony that would resolve the very moral concerns he had been pressured to address. As evening approached, Jake and Rebecca found themselves planning not just a wedding but a comprehensive legal strategy to protect their family from external threats. The romantic aspects of marriage had been overshadowed by immediate practical necessities, but both understood that their commitment to each other was no less genuine for being born out of crisis. "Are you afraid?" Rebecca asked as they worked by lamplight to prepare documents and gather the materials they would need for a proper ceremony. "Terrified," Jake admitted. "Not of marrying you, but of the possibility that we might not be able to protect what we've built. This child is going to be mine in every way that matters, and I won't let anyone take our family apart." Outside, the first blizzard of the season was beginning to develop, adding urgency to their planning. If Thomas Harrison's representatives were already traveling toward Wyoming, the weather might delay their arrival just long enough for Jake and Rebecca to establish their legal position. But if the storm passed quickly, they could find themselves facing challenges that would test everything they had learned about survival, partnership, and the fierce determination required to protect the people you love. As they settled in for what might be their last night as unmarried partners, both Rebecca and Jake understood that their relationship was about to be tested in ways that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the future of the family they were determined to create together. The emergency wedding preparations began before dawn, with Jake riding through the mounting blizzard to Pine Ridge, while Rebecca worked to transform their modest dugout into something resembling a proper wedding venue. The irony of seeking help from the very community that had threatened them wasn't lost on either of them, but survival often required setting aside pride in favor of practical necessity. Jake found Reverend Caldwell at the parsonage, a modest structure behind the church that served as both residence and office for the circuit preacher. The Reverend was clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, caught between his personal conviction that Jake and Rebecca were decent people and the considerable pressure from his congregation to take a moral stand. "I understand you're requesting a marriage ceremony," Reverend Caldwell said, his tone carefully neutral as he invited Jake inside from the storm, under rather urgent circumstances. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, removing his hat and shaking off the accumulated snow. "Rebecca and I have decided that we want to formalize our partnership before the baby comes, and we'd prefer to do it properly with church blessing and community witness." Reverend Caldwell studied Jake's face, looking for signs of desperation or coercion that might suggest the marriage was being entered into for purely expedient reasons. What he saw instead was the steady determination of a man who had thought carefully about his commitments and was prepared to honor them regardless of external pressure. "Is Mrs. Harrison agreeable to this arrangement?" the Reverend asked. "She is," Jake confirmed. "In fact, it was her suggestion. We've both come to understand that our partnership has grown into something deeper than convenience, and we want to make that official." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside as several riders approached through the storm. Through the frosted window, Jake could see Margaret Hutchins leading a delegation that included her husband, Tom Bradley, and several other prominent community members. Their arrival suggested that news of the emergency marriage had already spread, and that the community was preparing to take a more active role in the proceedings. Margaret entered the parsonage without invitation, her face flushed from the cold and her expression radiating righteous indignation. "Reverend Caldwell," she announced, "we've come to discuss this travesty that's being planned. The community will not stand for a sham marriage designed to cover up months of improper conduct." Jake felt his temper rising at Margaret's presumptuous tone, but Reverend Caldwell raised a calming hand before the situation could escalate into open conflict. "Mrs. Hutchins," the Reverend said firmly, "marriage ceremonies are conducted between the participants and their God, with the church serving as witness and blessing. The community's role is to support Christian union, not to obstruct it." The exchange revealed the fundamental tension within the community itself. While Margaret and her allies saw Jake and Rebecca's marriage as an attempt to legitimize scandal, others recognized it as exactly the kind of solution that frontier life often required. Tom Bradley, despite his friendship with Jake, had been caught in the middle of these competing perspectives. The issue, Margaret continued, undeterred by the Reverend's gentle rebuke, is whether this marriage represents genuine Christian commitment or merely an attempt to avoid the consequences of improper behavior. The timing suggests desperation rather than devotion. Before Jake could respond to this direct attack on his motivations, a new complication arrived in the form of two well-dressed strangers who entered the parsonage with the confident bearing of men accustomed to having their authority respected. The taller of the two men, clearly the leader, removed his hat and addressed the room with formal courtesy that barely concealed the underlying menace. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, his cultured accent marking him as an Easterner of some education and refinement. "I am Attorney Samuel Whitmore, representing the interests of Mr. Thomas Harrison of Chicago. I believe we have matters of mutual concern to discuss." The attorney's arrival sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. His presence meant that Thomas Harrison's threats weren't empty bluster. Legal machinery was already in motion that could separate Rebecca from her child regardless of any marriage ceremony they might arrange. "What exactly is the nature of your business here?" Reverend Caldwell asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Mr. Harrison has received disturbing reports about the welfare of his deceased brother's unborn child," Attorney Whitmore replied smoothly. "He has petitioned the territorial court for emergency custody, pending investigation of the mother's fitness to provide proper care and moral guidance." Jake felt the room spinning slightly as the full implications of the attorney's words sank in. Thomas Harrison hadn't just threatened legal action. He had already initiated it, and his representatives had arrived with sufficient authority to take immediate action if they deemed it necessary. "On what grounds?" Jake demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. Attorney Whitmore consulted a leather portfolio with theatrical precision. "Abandonment of proper residence, cohabitation with an unrelated male, failure to provide adequate prenatal care, and evidence of moral conduct inconsistent with responsible motherhood." Each charge was carefully calculated to sound damning while remaining vague enough to be difficult to refute directly. The abandonment of proper residence referred to Rebecca's decision to winter at Jake's dugout, rather than attempting to survive alone in her incomplete cabin. Cohabitation with an unrelated male spoke for itself, while inadequate prenatal care could be supported by the simple fact that professional medical attention was limited in frontier areas. "Those charges are completely false," Jake said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "Rebecca has received excellent care, and our living arrangements are entirely proper." "Nevertheless," Attorney Whitmore continued imperturbable, "Mr. Harrison has legitimate concerns about the welfare of his brother's child, and he has both the legal right and the financial resources to ensure those concerns are properly addressed." The threat was clear and immediate. Thomas Harrison's wealth and political connections gave him significant advantages in any legal proceeding, while Rebecca and Jake's frontier circumstances could easily be portrayed as unsuitable for child rearing by attorneys skilled in manipulation of urban prejudices against rural life. Margaret Hutchkins, sensing an opportunity to align herself with what appeared to be the winning side, stepped forward with renewed confidence. "The community has been concerned about Mrs. Harrison's situation for some time," she declared. "We've tried to address the moral issues through proper channels, but our concerns have been ignored." The betrayal was stunning in its calculated cruelty. Margaret was essentially offering to serve as a witness against Rebecca, providing community validation for Thomas Harrison's accusations in exchange for social positioning with the attorney's obviously superior resources. But Jake had not survived 3 years of frontier hardships by backing down from difficult fights. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the authority he had learned during his brief military service, "you're operating under some serious misunderstandings about the situation here. Mrs. Harrison and I are being married this morning." "Which?" resolves any questions about the propriety of our arrangements. She has received excellent prenatal care from Mrs. Patterson, the most qualified midwife in the territory. And our living conditions, while modest, are entirely adequate for raising a healthy child. Attorney Whitmore's response revealed the calculated nature of his approach. I'm afraid a hasty marriage ceremony, conducted under these circumstances, would be viewed by the court as exactly the kind of manipulative behavior that supports Mr. Harrison's concerns about the mother's character. The legal trap was elegant and devastating. If Rebecca remained unmarried, she could be portrayed as morally unfit. If she married Jake under current circumstances, the marriage itself would be used as evidence of desperation and poor judgment. Thomas Harrison's attorney had constructed a situation where almost any action Rebecca took could be used against her, but Jake had one more card to play, and the time had come to use it. Reverend Caldwell, he said, turning to address the preacher directly, I'd like to make a formal statement about my intentions and my relationship with Mrs. Harrison, for the record and in the presence of these witnesses. The Reverend nodded, recognizing the importance of whatever Jake was about to reveal. Please proceed. Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would fundamentally change how everyone in the room viewed the situation. I love Rebecca Harrison, he said clearly. I have loved her for months, and I intend to spend the rest of my life caring for her and the child she's carrying. Our marriage isn't a desperate attempt to avoid scandal, it's the formal recognition of a commitment I made to her and to our family long before any of these legal threats emerged. The declaration was simple and powerful, cutting through the legal maneuvering and social manipulation to reveal the essential truth of their relationship. But Jake wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, I have documentation proving that I've been making regular payments to Mrs. Patterson for prenatal care, that I've been improving Rebecca's cabin to provide proper housing for a family, and that I've been establishing economic arrangements that will provide stable support for a wife and child. Jake produced a folder of papers from his coat receipts, work contracts, and correspondence that demonstrated months of careful planning for a family future. The documentation provided concrete evidence that their relationship was based on genuine commitment rather than expedient arrangement. Attorney Whitmore examined the papers with professional thoroughness, his expression revealing that Jake's evidence was more comprehensive than he had anticipated. The receipts for medical care alone would make it difficult to sustain charges of inadequate prenatal attention, while the construction contracts and improvement work suggested long-term planning that contradicted accusations of hasty decision-making. This is all very interesting, Attorney Whitmore said finally, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue of moral fitness. Margaret Hutchins, sensing that the tide might be turning against her position, made one last attempt to influence the proceedings. The community standards, she began. The community standards, Reverend Caldwell interrupted with surprising firmness, support marriage between people who love each other and are committed to building Christian families. That appears to be exactly what Mr. Mitchell and Mrs. Harrison are proposing. The Reverend's support was crucial and unexpected. Despite the pressure from Margaret's faction, he had apparently decided that genuine commitment deserved church blessing regardless of the circumstances that had brought it about. But the legal battle was far from over. Attorney Whitmore had not traveled through a blizzard to be deterred by community sentiment or religious blessing. Gentlemen, he said, I'm afraid the court's concerns extend beyond local opinion. Mr. Harrison has prepared alternative arrangements for the child's care that include proper education, social advantages, and financial security that Frontier life simply cannot provide. The ultimate threat had finally been revealed. Thomas Harrison wasn't just questioning Rebecca's fitness as a mother. He was proposing to take her child and raise it as a member of his own wealthy family, providing opportunities that a Wyoming homestead could never match. Money isn't everything, Jake said. though he knew his words sounded inadequate against the material advantages that Thomas Harrison could offer. "Perhaps not," Attorney Whitmore replied, "but love and good intentions aren't sufficient substitutes for proper education, medical care, and social preparation for adult responsibilities." The argument was powerful and troubling because it contained elements of truth. Thomas Harrison could indeed provide educational and economic opportunities that frontier life made impossible. But he could also provide those advantages only by separating a child from its mother during the most crucial period of development. As the debate continued, Rebecca herself was fighting a different kind of battle. The stress of the legal threats, combined with the physical demands of advanced pregnancy, had triggered the onset of labor several weeks before the expected due date. Alone in the dugout, she found herself facing the terrifying prospect of giving birth without assistance, while her future was being decided by strangers in town. The pain that had started as mild discomfort was rapidly intensifying into full labor contractions. Rebecca realized with growing panic that her child was going to be born within hours, possibly before Jake returned from Pine Ridge. If Thomas Harrison's representatives gained custody at birth, she might never see her baby again. As the storm raged outside and legal battles continued in town, Rebecca Harrison prepared to fight the most important battle of her life, bringing her child safely into the world while protecting both their futures from forces determined to tear their family apart before it could even begin. The sound that changed everything was the desperate neighing of thunder, Jake's paint stallion, echoing across the storm-lashed prairie as the horse broke free from his hitching post and galloped toward the dugout. Animals possessed instincts that humans often ignored, and Thunder's urgent flight from town carried a message that transcended the legal arguments still raging in Reverend Caldwell's parsonage. Jake recognized his horse's distress call immediately, cutting through Attorney Whitmore's latest procedural threat with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned to read the signs that meant survival or disaster on the frontier. "Something's wrong," he announced, already moving toward the door despite the continuing blizzard outside. "Mr. Mitchell," Attorney Whitmore called after him, "this legal proceeding isn't concluded. You can't simply, the proceeding can wait." Jake replied grimly, pulling on his coat and hat. "If my horse broke loose to come get me, Rebecca needs help now." Reverend Caldwell, recognizing the genuine emergency in Jake's voice, stepped forward with decisive authority. "Mr. Whitmore, legal matters must sometimes yield to immediate human need. If Mrs. Harrison is in distress, our Christian duty is clear." The Reverend's support provided Jake with the moral backing he needed to leave the legal confrontation unresolved, but it also forced Attorney Whitmore to make a crucial decision about his own priorities. The attorney could remain in town arguing legal technicalities, or he could witness firsthand the character and circumstances he had been hired to investigate. "Very well," Attorney Whitmore said after a moment's calculation. "Perhaps it would be instructive to observe the actual living conditions we've been discussing." Margaret Hutchkins, unwilling to be left out of what promised to be the climactic resolution of the community's moral crisis, insisted on joining the expedition despite the dangerous weather. Her husband, showing more practical sense, attempted to dissuade her, but Margaret's determination to witness Rebecca's downfall overrode concerns about personal safety. The ride through the blizzard was harrowing even for experienced frontier travelers. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere yards, and the temperature had dropped to levels that could kill an exposed person within minutes. Jake led the way, following Thunder's tracks and his own intimate knowledge of the terrain, while the others struggled to keep pace through drifts that reached their horses' bellies. When they finally reached the dugout, the scene that greeted them was not the one that Attorney Whitmore had been led to expect. Instead of the crude shelter that Margaret Hutchkins had described, they found a well-constructed homestead that showed clear evidence of careful planning and skilled workmanship. Smoke rising from the properly installed chimney indicated efficient heating, while the expanded outbuilding suggested a thriving agricultural operation rather than desperate subsistence living. But Jake's attention was focused entirely on the sounds coming from inside the dugout. Rebecca's voice, tight with pain but steady with determination, calling his name through the storm. He dismounted and rushed inside, leaving the others to form their own impressions of the homestead that had become the center of legal and social controversy. Inside, Jake found Rebecca in the advanced stages of labor, having managed the early contractions alone while maintaining the presence of mind to prepare everything needed for the birth. The main room had been transformed into a makeshift birthing chamber, with clean linens arranged on the bed and water heating over the fire. Despite her obvious pain, Rebecca had maintained the kind of organized competence that spoke to her fundamental strength of character. "The baby's coming now," she gasped between contractions. "Mrs. Patterson, did you reach her?" Jake's heart sank as he realized that the legal confrontation had prevented him from completing the essential errand of fetching the midwife. Mrs. Patterson was still in town, possibly unaware of the emergency, while Rebecca faced the immediate challenge of giving birth with only improvised assistance. "I'll get her," Jake said, already turning back toward the door, but Rebecca grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "No time," she said urgently. "The baby's coming whether we're ready or not. You'll have to help me." The responsibility was terrifying for someone with no medical training, but Jake had learned that frontier life often demanded rising to challenges that seemed impossible. Drawing on half-remembered conversations with Mrs. Patterson and his own practical experience with animal births, he began preparing to assist Rebecca through the most critical moments of their lives. Outside, Attorney Whitmore and his companions had taken shelter in the workshop area, where they found themselves confronted with evidence that contradicted every assumption they had made about Jake and Rebecca's circumstances. The workshop contained tools and completed projects that demonstrated both skill and long-term planning. More significantly, they discovered Rebecca's completed cabin plans, showing detailed preparations for a proper family home that would meet any reasonable standard for child rearing. Margaret Hutchins, finding her expectations of squalor disappointed, attempted to maintain her critical stance. "Well-equipped workshops don't address moral concerns," she declared, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. But Reverend Caldwell was examining items that told a different story about the relationship. He had been pressured to condemn hand-carved wooden toys clearly intended for a child, carefully preserved samples of Rebecca's needlework showing preparations for baby clothes, and meticulously maintained account books demonstrating financial responsibility and forward planning. "This isn't the situation you described to me, Mrs. Hutchins," the Reverend said quietly. "These people have been preparing for a family with exactly the kind of devotion and responsibility that we should be encouraging, not condemning." Attorney Whitmore, conducting his own professional assessment of the evidence around him, was reaching similar conclusions. The documentation Jake had produced earlier, combined with the physical evidence of careful preparation and skilled workmanship, painted a picture of commitment competence that would be difficult to challenge in any honest legal proceeding. But the most compelling evidence was yet to come. From inside the dugout, they could hear Jake's voice, calm and encouraging, guiding Rebecca through the final stages of labor with a tenderness that spoke to genuine love rather than mere obligation. His words, clearly audible through the thin walls, revealed a man completely devoted to Rebecca's welfare and utterly committed to the child they were bringing into the world together. "You're doing perfectly," Jake's voice carried through the storm. "Just a little more and we'll have our baby." The possessive pronoun, "our baby," was significant in ways that transcended legal technicalities. This was a man who had already claimed the child emotionally, regardless of biological relationships or custody documents. More importantly, it was a claim that Rebecca clearly welcomed and reciprocated. "I can see the head," Jake announced, his voice tight with wonder and concentration. "Keep pushing, Rebecca. Our child is almost here." The next few minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by Rebecca's breathing and Jake's steady encouragement. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the storm-muffled quiet, it carried with it the promise of new life that transformed everyone within hearing distance. "It's a girl," Jake announced, his voice breaking with emotion. "A perfect, beautiful little girl." Through the walls, they could hear Rebecca's tears of relief and joy, followed by Jake's gentle murmuring as he attended to both mother and child with careful tenderness. The sounds were so intimate and moving that even Margaret Hutchins found herself wiping away tears, while Attorney Whitmore stood, quietly contemplating the inadequacy of legal documents to capture the reality of genuine family bonds. When Jake finally emerged from the dugout an hour later, he carried in his arms a bundle that contained Wyoming's newest citizen, a tiny girl who would grow up knowing that she had been wanted, planned for, and protected by people who understood the true meaning of family commitment. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Hutchins," Jake said simply, "I'd like you to meet Eleanor Sarah Mitchell." The name was significant in multiple ways. Eleanor had been Rebecca's mother's name, connecting the child to her maternal heritage, while Sarah honored Jake's first wife, demonstrating his ability to honor the past while embracing the future. But it was the surname Mitchell, rather than Harrison, that carried the most important message about how this family viewed itself. Attorney Whitmore found himself in the unusual position of questioning everything he had been hired to accomplish. The scene he had witnessed, the careful preparations, the genuine devotion, the successful birth attended by a man who clearly understood both the responsibilities and the joys of fatherhood, contradicted every assumption underlying Thomas Harrison's custody petition. "Mr. Mitchell," the attorney said carefully, "may I ask about your legal standing regarding this child?" Jake's response was immediate and uncompromising. "She's my daughter in every way that matters. I've been providing for her mother throughout the pregnancy, preparing for her arrival, and taking responsibility for her welfare. If Mr. Harrison wants to challenge my parental rights, he'll have to prove that his money can provide something more important than the love and commitment she received here." The challenge was direct and powerful, cutting through legal technicalities to address fundamental questions about what constituted a child's best interests. Money could provide educational opportunities and social advantages, but it couldn't provide the kind of unconditional love and acceptance that Eleanor Sarah Mitchell would receive from parents who had chosen each other and their family through mutual commitment rather than biological accident or social obligation. Reverend Caldwell stepped forward with the authority of someone who had finally recognized his duty. "Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Harrison, if you're still interested in solemnizing your marriage, I would be honored to perform the ceremony. This child deserves to be born into a family that's united in the eyes of God as well as in their own hearts." The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything the Wyoming Territory had ever witnessed. Conducted in the warm shelter of the dugout, with a newborn baby as the primary witness and a blizzard providing dramatic accompaniment, it represented the kind of practical romance that frontier life demanded. Rebecca, still weak from childbirth, but radiant with happiness, spoke her vows while holding Eleanor in her arms. Jake's promise to love and protect his wife and daughter carried the weight of commitments already demonstrated through months of shared struggle and mutual support. Attorney Whitmore found himself serving as an unexpected witness to proceedings that effectively demolished his client's legal case. Thomas Harrison's custody petition was based on assumptions about Rebecca's unfitness and Jake's unreliability that had been thoroughly contradicted by the evidence of genuine family stability and commitment. When the storm finally cleared 3 days later, Attorney Whitmore departed for Chicago with a report that would disappoint his client but accurately reflected the reality he had observed. Thomas Harrison's wealth and social position couldn't compete with the kind of family bonds that had been forged through shared adversity and mutual devotion. Margaret Hutchins, her moral crusade thoroughly discredited by the obvious happiness and stability of the family she had tried to destroy, found herself gradually excluded from community leadership as neighbors recognized the destructive nature of her judgmental attitudes. By spring, the Mitchell family, for that's how everyone in the territory thought of them, had completed Rebecca's cabin and established themselves as one of the most successful homesteading operations in the region. Jake's cattle operation was thriving. Rebecca's expanded poultry business was providing steady income, and little Eleanor was growing into a healthy, cheerful child who would never question her place in a family that had chosen love over convention. Lumber that Rebecca had struggled to transport through the storm months earlier had become the foundation for a home that sheltered not just a family, but a testament to the power of partnership, determination, and the kind of love that grows stronger when tested by adversity. As Jake and Rebecca sat on their completed porch one evening, watching Eleanor take her first tentative steps across the wooden floors that represented so much struggle and triumph, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from individual survival to family prosperity. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that wheel hadn't broken on your sledge? Jake asked. Eleanor balanced on his knee as she reached for the wooden toys he had carved during the long winter evenings. Rebecca smiled, remembering the desperate woman who had dragged lumber across the prairie alone, pregnant and afraid. That woman seemed like a stranger now, though the determination that had carried her through those dark days remained the foundation of everything they had built together. "I think we would have found each other somehow," she replied. "People who are meant to be partners usually find a way, even when the circumstances seem impossible." Outside, the Wyoming wind still carried its eternal song across the prairie. But inside their home, the Mitchell family had created something that would endure long after storms passed, a legacy of love, commitment, and the simple truth that the strongest foundations are built not from lumber and nails, but from the daily choice to stand together against whatever challenges the world might offer. 5 years had transformed the Mitchell homestead from a desperate survival operation into one of the most prosperous family enterprises in the Wyoming Territory. What had begun with Rebecca's struggle to haul lumber through a storm had evolved into a thriving ranch that served as proof of what could be accomplished when determination met opportunity and love provided the foundation for everything else. Eleanor, Sarah Mitchell, now a spirited 5-year-old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, raced across the expansive yard that separated the main house from the various outbuildings that comprised their growing operation. The original dugout had been preserved as a workshop and root cellar, but the family now lived in a 2-story house that incorporated both David Harrison's original cabin plans and Jake's practical improvements into something that exceeded either man's individual vision. The house itself told the story of their journey. The foundation stones had been quarried from the creek where Rebecca once hauled water, while the lumber came from the same mill where she had struggled to purchase materials for her desperate construction project. But where her original cabin had been designed for mere survival, this home was built for prosperity, with spacious rooms, large windows, and the kind of architectural details that spoke of confidence in the future. Jake stood on the front porch, watching Eleanor chase chickens through the yard while Rebecca worked in the expanded garden that now supplied vegetables, not just for their own table, but for sale to the growing network of mining camps and railroad towns that had sprung up across the territory. The sight never failed to remind him of that storm-lashed evening when he had first seen a lone figure struggling with an impossible load, driven by the kind of determination that had ultimately transformed both their lives. The cattle operation that Jake had dreamed of for years was now a reality, with over 200 head of mixed breeding stock grazing across pastures that stretched to the horizon. The animals bore the Mitchell brand, a simple design that combined elements representing both lumber construction and the mathematical precision that had characterized Rebecca's approach to every challenge they had faced together. More importantly, the ranch had become a model for other homesteading families in the region. Jake and Rebecca had developed innovative techniques for frontier construction, livestock management, and agricultural production that were being copied by neighbors throughout the territory. Their success had proven that prosperity was possible for people willing to combine traditional frontier virtues with careful planning and mutual cooperation. The lumber business that had begun with Rebecca's desperate need for building materials had evolved into a profitable side enterprise. Jake's workshop produced custom furniture, construction components, and specialized tools that were in demand throughout the territory. The quality of his craftsmanship had earned a reputation that extended far beyond the local community, with orders arriving regularly from customers in Denver, Cheyenne, and even as far away as San Francisco. Rebecca had established her own reputation as the most successful poultry operator in the region. What had started with 6 hens had grown into a flock of over 300 birds, producing eggs and meat that commanded premium prices in markets throughout Wyoming and Colorado. More significantly, she had developed breeding techniques that produced chickens particularly well adapted to high-altitude frontier conditions, creating a new strain that was being purchased by homesteaders across the Mountain West. But their success extended beyond mere economic prosperity. The Mitchell family had become leaders in the emerging social fabric of Wyoming territory, with their home serving as an unofficial community center for everything from church services to political meetings. Rebecca had established the territory's first lending library, while Jake served as an unofficial arbitrator for disputes between neighboring homesteaders. Eleanor's childhood was unfolding in ways that would have seemed impossible during those desperate months when her mother hauled lumber alone through Wyoming storms. She was learning to read from books that arrived regularly from Eastern publishers, studying mathematics from her father's engineering manuals, and developing practical skills through daily participation in the ranch operations that would make her capable of managing any frontier challenge. More importantly, she was growing up with an understanding of partnership and mutual respect that would serve her well, regardless of what path her life eventually took. Jake and Rebecca had been careful to model the kind of relationship they wanted her to expect in her own adult life, one based on shared work, mutual support, and the kind of love that grew stronger when tested by adversity. The community that had once whispered about Rebecca's scandalous living arrangements now pointed to the Mitchell family as an example of frontier success achieved through proper values and hard work. Margaret Hutchins, her moral authority thoroughly discredited by the obvious happiness and prosperity of the family she had tried to destroy, had eventually moved back east with her husband, unable to maintain her position in a community that had witnessed her vindictive judgment being so completely refuted by subsequent events. Reverend Caldwell, now approaching retirement after decades of frontier ministry, often used the Mitchell family story in his sermons as an example of how God's grace could transform desperate circumstances into abundant blessing for those who maintained faith and treated each other with genuine Christian love. The wedding he had performed in a dugout during a blizzard had become legendary throughout the territory as proof that the most important ceremonies were often the least conventional. Attorney Samuel Whitmore had returned to Chicago with a report that effectively ended Thomas Harrison's custody ambitions, but the experience had also changed the attorney's own perspective on what constituted a child's best interests. He had eventually left his lucrative corporate practice to work with child welfare organizations, using his legal skills to protect vulnerable children rather than simply serving the interests of wealthy clients. Thomas Harrison himself had never attempted further contact with his brother's family, apparently recognizing that his money and social position could not compete with the kind of stable, loving home that Eleanor had found with the Mitchells. The Chicago businessman's own childless marriage had eventually ended in divorce, leaving him to contemplate the emptiness of material success without genuine family bonds. The original lumber that Rebecca had struggled so desperately to transport was still visible in the framework of their home. Weathered now but as solid as the day Jake had helped her install it. Sometimes during quiet evenings when Eleanor was asleep and the ranch work was completed, Rebecca and Jake would run their hands along those original boards, remembering the desperate woman and struggling cowboy who had first met during a prairie storm. "Do you ever regret how hard it was in the beginning?" Rebecca asked during one of these reflective moments, her hand resting on lumber that had once represented the difference between survival and disaster. Jake considered the question seriously, as he always did when Rebecca asked about their past. "I regret that you had to struggle alone for so long before we found each other," he said finally. "But I don't regret the difficulty, because it taught us what we were capable of when we worked together." Their partnership had indeed been forged in adversity, but it had grown stronger through shared prosperity. They had learned to trust each other during the desperate months when survival was uncertain, and that trust had become the foundation for the kind of deep love that could weather any storm that Wyoming weather or human nature might bring their way. Eleanor's education was proceeding according to plans that would have amazed the desperate woman who had once counted coins carefully. To purchase basic lumber, private tutors arrived regularly from Denver to supplement the basic instruction that Rebecca and Jake provided, while correspondence courses ensured that Eleanor would be prepared for whatever advanced education she might choose to pursue. Perhaps more importantly, Eleanor was learning practical skills that would serve her well regardless of academic achievements. She could handle horses, manage chickens, keep accurate financial records, and perform basic construction work with tools that her father had modified specifically for her smaller hands. She was growing up with the kind of comprehensive competence that would make her capable of thriving in any environment. The lumber mill in Pine Ridge, where Rebecca had once stood in line with carefully counted coins, now competed for the Mitchell family's business, offering special terms and priority service to customers whose success had become legendary throughout the territory. The mill foreman who had once questioned whether a pregnant woman could handle construction work now regularly consulted with Rebecca about lumber specifications for customers attempting their own ambitious building projects. As autumn approaches, bringing with it the anniversary of that first desperate storm that had brought them together, Jake and Rebecca began planning their most ambitious project yet. They had decided to establish a school that would serve not just Eleanor but all the children in their growing community, providing the kind of education that would prepare frontier youth for the expanding opportunities that the 20th century would bring to the American West. The school would be built using lumber from the same mill where Rebecca had once struggled to purchase materials for her basic cabin. But it would incorporate construction techniques and educational philosophies that represented everything they had learned about building institutions that could endure. More importantly, it would serve as a lasting legacy of their belief that every child deserves the kind of opportunities that Eleanor was receiving. "We're going to need a lot of lumber for a proper schoolhouse," Rebecca observed as they reviewed architectural plans that rivaled anything being built in major eastern cities. Jake smiled, remembering the woman who had once struggled to transport a single load of boards across the prairie. "Good thing we know someone who's become a pretty expert at managing lumber procurement and construction projects." The joke was gentle and affectionate, acknowledging how far they had both traveled from the desperate circumstances that had first brought them together. But it also recognized the continuity between Rebecca's original determination to build something lasting and their current ability to create institutions that would benefit generations of frontier families. As they sat together on their porch, watching Eleanor play in the yard that represented security they had once thought impossible, Jake and Rebecca reflected on the journey that had transformed them from individual survivors into a family whose influence extended far beyond their own property lines. The lumber that had once represented Rebecca's desperate hope for basic shelter had become the foundation for prosperity that would echo through generations. Outside, the Wyoming wind still carried its eternal song across the prairie, but inside their home, the Mitchell family had created something that would endure long after storms passed, a legacy built not just from lumber and nails, but from the daily choice to face every challenge together, with love as the foundation and mutual respect as the frame that held everything else in place. Eleanor's laughter echoed across the prairie as she discovered a new clutch of chicks in the henhouse, her joy serving as a reminder that the greatest achievements were often the simplest ones, creating a home where love could flourish, children could grow safely, and two people who had found each other against impossible odds could build something beautiful together. The lumber still stood strong, weathered but enduring, a testament to the power of determination, the grace of unexpected love, and the simple truth that the strongest foundations are built one board at a time, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until something beautiful emerges from what once seemed like impossible circumstances. 25 years had passed since Rebecca Harrison first dragged lumber across the Wyoming prairie, and the territory had transformed itself into a state where opportunity flourished for those bold enough to seize it. Eleanor Sarah Mitchell, now 30 and bearing her father's gift for engineering combined with her mother's practical wisdom, stood before the newly completed Carnegie Library in the town that had grown around the original Pine Ridge settlement, preparing to deliver the dedication speech that would mark another milestone in her family's extraordinary legacy. The library represented the culmination of dreams that had begun in a storm-lashed dugout where her parents had shared evening conversations about education, opportunity, and the kind of community they wanted to build for future generations. The building itself incorporated architectural innovations that Eleanor had developed during her studies at the Colorado School of Engineering, making it one of the most advanced public buildings in the Mountain West. But the library was more than just another construction project. It housed the Rebecca Mitchell Collection, a comprehensive archive of frontier women's experiences that Eleanor had been assembling for over a decade. The collection included not just her mother's own writings and correspondence, but oral histories, photographs, and artifacts that told the previously untold story of the women who had built the American West through determination, innovation, and the kind of quiet heroism that rarely made newspaper headlines. Eleanor's own story had unfolded in ways that would have seemed impossible to the pregnant woman who had once struggled alone with lumber and hope. After completing her engineering degree, the first woman to graduate from her program, she had returned to Wyoming to establish the Mitchell Engineering Company, specializing in construction projects that required both technical sophistication and understanding of frontier conditions. Her reputation had grown through a series of challenging projects that showcased her unique combination of academic training and practical frontier experience. She had designed irrigation systems that transformed arid rangeland into productive agricultural areas, constructed bridges that connected isolated communities to broader economic opportunities, and developed building techniques that allowed substantial structures to be erected quickly and economically in remote locations. But perhaps her most significant professional achievement was the establishment of the Western Women's Technical Institute, the first institution in the country specifically designed to provide women with advanced training in engineering, construction, and agricultural sciences. The institute had attracted students from across the nation and several foreign countries, becoming a beacon for women who refused to accept traditional limitations on their ambitions and capabilities. The institute's campus, located on land donated by the Mitchell family, included dormitories, classrooms, workshops, and laboratories that rivaled those found at the most prestigious Eastern universities. But it also included practical training facilities, working farms, construction sites, and experimental stations where students learned to apply theoretical knowledge to real-world challenges. Eleanor had never married, a choice that had initially scandalized conservative elements of Wyoming society, but had gradually come to be seen as evidence of her dedication to advancing opportunities for other women. She had been courted by numerous accomplished men, including fellow engineers, successful ranchers, and even a railroad executive who had offered to make her the most powerful woman in the Mountain West. But Eleanor's understanding of partnership had been shaped by watching her parents build something extraordinary together, and she had never found someone who shared both her ambitious vision and her commitment to the kind of mutual respect that made genuine collaboration possible. Rather than compromise her standards or abandon her goals, she had chosen to focus her considerable energies on creating institutions that would outlast any individual relationship. Her relationship with her parents had evolved over the years, from dependence through independence to a mature partnership that allowed each family member to contribute their unique strengths to shared enterprises. Jake, now approaching 70, but still possessing the steady competence that had first attracted Rebecca's respect, had become Eleanor's primary collaborator in developing the construction techniques that made large-scale, frontier-building projects economically feasible. Rebecca, whose practical intelligence had matured into something approaching genius in matters of resource management and organizational planning, served as the business mind behind Eleanor's various enterprises. Her ability to coordinate complex projects involving multiple contractors, suppliers, and regulatory agencies had become legendary throughout the region, with business leaders traveling from major cities to consult with the woman who had learned management principles through the school of frontier necessity. The original ranch continued to thrive under their collective management, but it had evolved far beyond cattle raising and poultry production. The Mitchell spread now included experimental farms that tested new agricultural techniques, vocational training programs that taught practical skills to young people throughout the region, and research facilities that developed innovations in everything from livestock breeding to sustainable land management. More importantly, the ranch had become a model for the kind of diversified economic development that could sustain rural communities even as the frontier era came to an end. Visitors arrived regularly from agricultural colleges, government agencies, and foreign countries to study methods that had transformed a modest homestead into a comprehensive economic ecosystem that provided employment and opportunity for hundreds of families. The town of Pine Ridge itself had grown around the Mitchell family's various enterprises, evolving from a collection of frontier businesses into a prosperous community that attracted residents seeking both economic opportunity and the kind of social environment that valued individual achievement while maintaining strong community bonds. The general store where Margaret Hutchins had once organized moral crusades was now a modern mercantile establishment that served customers throughout the region, while the church where Reverend Caldwell had once navigated delicate social pressures had become the largest congregation in the state. Eleanor's dedication speech for the library drew on themes that connected her family's personal journey to the broader transformation of the American West. She spoke about the power of education to transform individual lives and entire communities, about the importance of preserving the stories of people who had built something extraordinary from seemingly impossible circumstances, and about the continuing need for institutions that encouraged both individual achievement and collective progress. This library represents more than just books and reading rooms, Eleanor told the assembled crowd, which included distinguished visitors from universities, government agencies, and cultural organizations throughout the nation. It represents our commitment to ensuring that future generations understand the courage, intelligence, and determination of the people who transformed wilderness into civilization through daily choices to work hard, treat each other with respect, and never abandon hope for something better. The speech drew enthusiastic applause, but Eleanor's most meaningful recognition came from the quiet satisfaction in her parents' eyes. Jake and Rebecca, now in their 70s, but still possessing the vitality that had carried them through decades of challenges, set in the front row with the kind of dignity that came from lives well lived and purposes fulfilled. After the ceremony, the three family members walked together through the town that had grown around their dreams, past businesses they had helped establish, schools they had supported, and homes that housed families whose opportunities had been expanded by Mitchell Family Enterprises. The evening light cast long shadows across streets that had once been prairie paths, reminding them of the journey that had brought them from individual survival to community leadership. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices along the way? Rebecca asked as they paused before the monument that marked the site of Jake's original dugout, now preserved as a historical landmark that told the story of Wyoming's frontier era. Eleanor, who had heard various versions of her family's story throughout her childhood, but had only recently begun to understand its full significance, considered the question with the analytical mind that had made her a successful engineer. I think we would have found ways to succeed regardless of the specific circumstances, she said finally. The important thing was that we learned to work together instead of struggling alone. Jake nodded approvingly at his daughter's assessment. Over the years, he had come to understand that their success had been based not on luck or extraordinary circumstances, but on fundamental principles that could be applied to any situation: treating people with respect, working harder than circumstances seemed to require, and maintaining faith that persistent effort would eventually create opportunities that hadn't previously existed. As they walked past the site where Rebecca's original cabin had stood, now occupied by the elementary school that bore her name, they reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in their own lives, but in the broader community that had grown around their efforts. Children who would have once faced limited educational opportunities now had access to resources that rivaled those available in major cities, while women who might have been confined to traditional roles now found pathways to careers in engineering, business, agriculture, and public service. The lumber mill where Rebecca had once struggled to purchase materials with carefully counted coins had evolved into a modern facility that supplied construction materials throughout the Mountain West. But it had never forgotten its role in the community's founding story. A plaque near the entrance honored Rebecca Harrison Mitchell, whose determination to build something permanent from temporary materials inspired a community's commitment to creating lasting institutions. Eleanor's engineering company had grown to employ over 200 people, making it one of the largest businesses in the state, but it maintained the family tradition of treating employees as partners rather than merely workers. Profit-sharing arrangements, educational assistance programs, and advancement opportunities based on merit rather than connections had created a workforce that combined technical competence with personal loyalty to the company's mission. The Western Women's Technical Institute had graduated over 500 women during its 15-year existence, with alumni establishing successful careers throughout the nation and several foreign countries. Many had returned to their home communities to establish businesses, schools, and social institutions that expanded opportunities for other women, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond Wyoming's borders. But perhaps the most significant achievement was the subtle transformation in how frontier communities understood the relationship between individual success and collective prosperity. The Mitchell family's example had demonstrated that personal advancement and community development were not competing goals but complementary aspects of the same fundamental process. As evening deepened and they returned to the ranch house that had been built with lumber Rebecca had once hauled alone through a storm, the three family members settled into the comfortable routine of reviewing the day's accomplishments and planning for tomorrow's challenges. Eleanor spread architectural drawings across the dining table, showing her parents the preliminary designs for a technical college that would expand the educational opportunities available to young people throughout the region. The foundational work will require some innovative engineering, Eleanor explained, pointing to specifications that would allow the buildings to withstand Wyoming's notorious weather while providing the kind of laboratory and workshop facilities that modern technical education demanded. But I think we can create something that will serve students well for the next century. Rebecca studied the plans with the eye of someone who had learned to evaluate construction projects in terms of both immediate functionality and long-term sustainability. What about funding? She asked, addressing the practical considerations that had shaped every decision throughout their family's history. I've been in discussion with several potential donors, Eleanor replied, including some of our institute graduates who have achieved considerable success in their own careers. There's also interest from federal education agencies and private foundations that support technical training programs. Jake examined the structural specifications with professional interest, noting how Eleanor had incorporated lessons learned from decades of frontier construction experience while adapting them to meet the requirements of modern institutional buildings. These foundation designs should handle anything Wyoming weather can throw at them, he observed approvingly. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that ranged from specific construction details to broader questions about the kind of education that would prepare young people for the challenges and opportunities of the 20th century. It was the kind of planning session that had characterized the Mitchell family's approach to every major undertaking: thorough analysis, careful preparation, and shared commitment to achieving results that would benefit not just themselves, but the broader community. As they prepared to retire for the night, Rebecca paused to look out the window at the moonlit landscape that stretched to the horizon, remembering the desperate woman who had once dragged lumber across this same prairie, with nothing but hope and determination to sustain her. That woman would have found it impossible to imagine the prosperity and influence that had grown from such humble beginnings, but she would have recognized the fundamental values that had made everything else possible. Tomorrow I want to visit the old dugout site, Rebecca said quietly. Eleanor's never seen the place where it all began, where we learned that the strongest foundations are built from mutual respect and shared dreams. Eleanor smiled, understanding that her mother was offering to share not just historical information, but the deeper wisdom that had guided every decision throughout their remarkable journey. I'd like that, she replied. I think it's time I understood the complete story of how lumber and love built everything we have today. Outside, the Wyoming wind still carried its eternal song across the prairie, but inside their home, 3 generations of the Mitchell family settled into sleep with the quiet satisfaction that came from lives dedicated to building something lasting, not just for themselves, but for all the generations that would follow in their footsteps. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.